Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, but she nodded and turned to leave the room without another word.
Now that we have Jacob, everything's different. I don't need her anymore. We don't need her anymore.
The silence that followed was suffocating. Maya stood frozen, her entire body trembling. The words had been too much for her young mind to process, but deep inside, she understood one thing clearly. Her mother no longer wanted her. It had been 12 long, aching years. Lydia sat by the large bay window of their suburban New Jersey home, her gaze fixed on the sprawling oak tree in their front yard. She watched the leaves fluttering gently in the evening breeze, their rustling sound barely audible through the closed windows. It was a peaceful sight, yet there was no peace inside her. There was only the endless ache of longing and a deep, growing void where hope once lived. She and Mark had tried everything. Specialists, fertility treatments, holistic therapies, even spiritual healers that her friends from the women's group had recommended. Yet, despite all their efforts, their home remained silent, devoid of the sound of children's laughter. Every morning, Lydia woke with the same heavy heart, her arms aching for a child she couldn't seem to have.
Maybe it's time to let go,
Mark had said one night, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting shadows on his face. His voice was gentle, but his words had cut through her like glass. He had meant well, he always did. But how could she let go of the one thing she had wanted her entire life? How could she accept a future without the joy of holding her own child? Mark turned to her in bed, his eyes filled with concern. He reached out, taking her hand in his.
Lydia. It's been 12 years. Maybe this isn't what's meant for us.
She had pulled her hand away then, the frustration and pain bubbling up into her throat.
You don't understand.
She whispered, turning her back to him. How could he? He wasn't the one whose body had betrayed them month after month, year after year. It wasn't his fault that they couldn't conceive, and while he always tried to stay positive, Mark didn't carry the same weight of guilt and failure that sat heavy on Lydia's chest. The conversations always ended this way, with silence and distance growing between them. They were a happy couple once, full of dreams and plans for a family, but each failed attempt chipped away at their bond. It was as if the very foundation of their marriage had started to crack, and Lydia feared that one day the whole thing would collapse. Mark had always been the optimist, the calm to her storm, but even his patience was running thin. She could see it in his eyes, the tiredness that had settled there over the years, and in the way his voice lacked the same spark when he talked about the future. His jokes no longer brought out her laughter. His assurances, once soothing, now felt hollow. Lydia leaned against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging up the surface as the sky dimmed into twilight. Another day had passed without any change, without any new possibility on the horizon. She had given up on hoping for miracles. After all, how long could one wait for something that seemed destined to never happen? But Mark wasn't willing to let their dream of having a family die just yet. His determination had taken a new form, a suggestion Lydia hadn't expected. One that had startled her when he first brought it up. Adoption.
Adoption.
Lydia had repeated, her voice skeptical, unsure. They were sitting in the living room, the warm light from the fireplace flickering across the walls. Mark's face, illuminated by the soft glow, was set in that familiar expression of quiet hope.
Yes, adoption,
he said gently.
There are so many children out there who need a home, Lydia. We've wanted to be parents for so long. Maybe this is the way we're meant to build our family.
Lydia had looked at him, studying his face as if trying to gauge how serious he was. Her heart clenched at the thought. She had always envisioned herself carrying her own child, feeling the life growing inside her, experiencing the bond that came from shared blood. But here Mark was, offering her another way, another chance to be a mother. Could she love an adopted child the way she had dreamed of loving one of her own? Could she give that child everything, without the nagging feeling that it wasn't quite the same?
I don't know.
Lydia had said slowly, her voice betraying the uncertainty that churned inside her.
It's not what I imagined.
Mark reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady.
It may not be what we imagined, but maybe it's what we need. Lydia, this child, whoever they are, would be ours, completely, in every way that matters.
His words hung in the air between them, and Lydia had stared into the fire, the flames flickering like the fragile hope within her. She didn't know if she was ready for this. Could she open her heart to a child that wasn't hers by birth? Would she feel the same joy, the same fulfillment? Or would it always feel like a second choice, a consolation prize for the dream that had slipped away? But then she looked at Mark again, at the love and the quiet resilience in his eyes, and she felt something shift inside her. She couldn't keep clinging to the past, to the dream that had refused to come true. Maybe this was the only way forward, the only chance they had at happiness. She nodded slowly, her heart still heavy with doubt, but her mind beginning to open to the idea.
Maybe
She whispered.
we can look into it.
Mark's face softened and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the fire crackled softly in the hearth.
We'll take it one step at a time.
He promised.
We'll find our way.
The decision to adopt didn't come easily. But once Lydia and Mark had made up their minds, the process began to move quickly. They spent countless hours filling out paperwork, meeting with social workers, and attending seminars about adoption. It was overwhelming at times, the legal jargon and the emotional roller coaster that came with each step of the process. But through it all, Mark remained steady, his belief in their decision never wavering. Lydia, on the other hand, was more cautious. Each meeting with the adoption agency left her feeling a little more exposed, as if she were opening herself up to something she wasn't sure she could handle. The questions they had to answer about their motivations for adopting, their ability to provide for a child, made her confront the parts of herself that still doubted whether she could truly love a child that didn't come from her own body. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of interviews, Lydia found herself sitting alone in the nursery they had prepared years ago. It had remained untouched for all this time, a silent reminder of the dreams they had once shared. The walls were painted a soft yellow, the crib standing empty in the corner, and a mobile of little stars and moons hung from the ceiling. She had once imagined spending countless nights in this room, rocking her baby to sleep, whispering lullabies into the quiet darkness. Now, as she sat there, Lydia felt a strange mix of grief and hope. She still mourned the loss of the child she had never been able to conceive. But for the first time in years, she also felt a glimmer of something new, an inkling that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of a different kind of love. 2 months later, the call came. A little girl, just 7 years old, was available for adoption. Her name was Maya. The first time Lydia laid eyes on Maya, she was struck by how small the girl seemed, sitting quietly in the corner of the agency's playroom. Her dark, curly hair framed a round face, and her big brown eyes seemed to take in everything around her. There was a quiet intensity to the way Maya observed the world, as if she were already too wise for her age. Mark knelt beside Maya, offering her a stuffed bear.
Hi there, Maya. I'm Mark, and this is Lydia.
He said gently. Maya hesitated, her little hands clutching the bear tightly to her chest as she looked up at Lydia with those wide, searching eyes. Lydia felt a pang of uncertainty, her heart skipping a beat. Could she be a mother to this child? Could she give Maya the love and care she deserved? But as she knelt down beside her husband, Lydia felt something stir deep inside her. There was something about Maya, her quiet strength, her vulnerability, that spoke to Lydia in a way she hadn't expected. Slowly, she reached out, offering Maya her hand.
Hi, Maya.
Lydia said softly.
It's so nice to meet you.
For a moment, Maya didn't move, her eyes still searching Lydia's face. But then, tentatively, the little girl reached out and placed her small hand in Lydia's. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, something shifted inside Lydia. It wasn't the overwhelming flood of love she had imagined it would be, but it was a start, a small spark of connection. Mark smiled, his eyes warm with emotion.
Welcome to the family, Maya.
The first few months with Maya were both beautiful and challenging. As much as Lydia wanted to open her heart fully to her new daughter, she found it difficult at times to bond with the little girl. Maya was quiet, often retreating into herself, and it was clear that the early years of her life had been marked by instability. Trust didn't come easily to her. Lydia, too, struggled with her own feelings. She wanted to be the perfect mother, but the doubts and insecurities gnawed at her. Every time Maya looked at her with those big, searching eyes, Lydia wondered if she was failing somehow. She wasn't sure how to reach Maya, how to bridge the gap that seemed to exist between them. It wasn't like what she had envisioned all those years ago when she dreamed of becoming a mother. The maternal instinct she had always thought would come naturally seemed elusive. Mark, on the other hand, fell into fatherhood with ease. He was patient with Maya, spending hours reading her stories, playing games with her, and tucking her in at night. Maya seemed to gravitate toward him, her face lighting up when he walked into the room. It was beautiful to watch, and yet it also filled Lydia with a quiet jealousy she couldn't shake. She wanted to be the one to make Maya feel safe and loved, but it felt like she was always just on the outside, looking in. One evening, as they sat together in the living room after Maya had gone to bed, Mark noticed the distance in Lydia's eyes.
Is everything okay?
He asked, concern etched across his face. Lydia sighed, sinking deeper into the sofa.
I don't know, I thought it would be different. Easier, maybe. I want to love her the way you do, but sometimes it feels like I'm pretending, like I'm not really her mother.
Mark reached for her hand, squeezing it gently.
Lydia, this isn't easy for any of us. Maya's been through a lot, and it's going to take time for her to open up, but that doesn't mean you're not doing a good job. You're trying, and that's what matters.
I know,
Lydia said, her voice quiet.
but I can't help feeling like she doesn't need me, not the way she needs you.
Mark smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face.
She does need you, Lydia. She just needs time to see that you're here for her, that you love her. And you do love her, even if it doesn't always feel like the way you imagined.
Lydia wanted to believe him, but deep down, the fear lingered, that maybe Maya would never fully be hers, that maybe their family would always feel incomplete. She tried to push the thought away, reminding herself that love could grow over time, that relationships weren't always instantaneous. But as the weeks turned into months, the doubts remained. Though Lydia struggled with her role as Maya's mother, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, that gave her hope. One afternoon, as Lydia was cooking dinner, Maya wandered into the kitchen. She stood by the counter, watching Lydia chop vegetables, her little hands fiddling with the hem of her dress.
What are you making?
Maya asked quietly, her voice soft and uncertain. Lydia glanced at her, surprised. It was one of the few times Maya had shown interest in something she was doing.
I'm making vegetable salad.
Lydia replied, offering her a smile.
Would you like to help?
Maya hesitated for a moment before nodding. Lydia handed her a small carrot and a peeler, showing her how to carefully scrape off the skin. Maya took the task seriously, her little hands working diligently as she peeled the carrot with precision. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Lydia felt a warmth blossom in her chest. It was a small thing, just peeling carrots together, but in that moment, it felt like a step towards something more, a bridge between them, slowly being built. Later that evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Lydia watched Maya carefully spoon the salad into her mouth. She looked up and smiled shyly at Lydia.
It's good.
She said. Lydia's heart swelled at the simple compliment.
I'm glad you like it, sweetheart.
Mark, watching the exchange, smiled knowingly at Lydia. It was a small victory, but it felt like a giant leap in the right direction. Over the next year, Lydia and Maya's relationship grew in small, almost imperceptible ways. There were still moments of distance, times when Lydia felt like she wasn't enough, or when Maya seemed to retreat into herself. But there were also moments of joy. They went to the park together, played board games, and read bedtime stories. Maya began to open up little by little, allowing Lydia to see more of her personality, her likes and dislikes, her fears and dreams. On the surface, their family life seemed to be falling into place. But despite these moments of connection, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was as if a part of her was still holding back, unable to fully surrender to the role of being Maya's mother. Then, something unexpected happened. It was a quiet morning when Lydia first felt the nausea. She brushed it off as nothing, but as the days passed, the symptoms persisted. Eventually, she decided to take a pregnancy test, more out of habit than hope. She had done it countless times over the years, and each time, the result had been the same, negative. But this time, when Lydia looked down at the test, her heart nearly stopped. 2 pink lines. She stared at the test, unable to believe what she was seeing. After 12 years of trying, of heartache and disappointment, it seemed impossible. Yet there it was, staring back at her. Confirmation of the one thing she had given up on long ago. Lydia's hands trembled as she called out for Mark. He came rushing into the bathroom, his eyes widening in shock as he saw the test in her hands.
Is it?
He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Lydia nodded,
I'm pregnant.
tears welling in her eyes. Mark pulled her into his arms, laughing through his own tears.
I can't believe it after all this time.
He whispered. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, both overwhelmed by the miracle they had never expected. But as the initial shock and joy began to settle, Lydia's mind turned to Maya. What would this mean for her? How would she react to the news that there would soon be a baby in the house? And perhaps more frighteningly, how would Lydia feel? As Lydia's pregnancy progressed, her excitement grew. She and Mark spent hours preparing for the arrival of their baby, buying clothes, setting up the nursery, and planning for the future. But as her belly grew, so too did the distance between her and Maya. At first, it was subtle. Lydia found herself more preoccupied with her pregnancy, spending less time with Maya, and more time daydreaming about the baby. She told herself that it was only natural, that any mother would be focused on the child growing inside her. But slowly, Lydia's behavior began to change. She no longer had the patience for Maya's quiet, introspective nature. Where once she had tried to connect with her, now she found herself irritated by Maya's need for attention. It was as if Lydia had mentally checked out of her role as Maya's mother, her thoughts consumed by the baby. Mark noticed the shift almost immediately.
Lydia, what's going on?
Asked one evening after dinner, his voice filled with concern.
You've been distant with Maya lately.
Lydia frowned, her hand unconsciously resting on her growing belly.
I've just been
She replied, brushing off his concerns.
tired. It's the pregnancy. I'm exhausted all the time.
Mark wasn't convinced.
That's not it, and you know it. You're pulling away from her.
I'm not pulling away.
Lydia snapped, her irritation flaring.
Hey, I'm focused on the baby right now, Mark. Isn't that normal? I'm finally pregnant after all these years. Shouldn't I be excited about that?
Of course you should be excited,
Mark said, his voice calm but firm.
but that doesn't mean you can just forget about Maya. She's our daughter too, Lydia. She needs you.
Lydia crossed her arms, defensive.
I haven't forgotten about her. She'll be fine. She's always been independent.
Mark's expression darkened.
She's 7 years old, Lydia. She's not as independent as you think. And she's starting to notice that you're treating her differently.
The words stung, but Lydia refused to acknowledge them. She didn't want to admit that Mark was right, that somewhere along the way, her feelings toward Maya had shifted. Instead, she doubled down on her defenses, convinced that everything would be fine once the baby arrived. But deep down, a nagging doubt began to take root, and as the weeks turned into months, the rift between Lydia and Maya continued to grow. 9 months came and went, and with it, a whirlwind of anticipation and excitement. Lydia's pregnancy was smooth, her body adjusting to the changes with relative ease. And before long, the day finally came. In the early hours of a warm spring morning, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The moment the doctor placed the squirming, crying infant in her arms, Lydia's world shifted irrevocably. Tears of joy streamed down her face as she cradled him close, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion she hadn't expected. Mark stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, gazing down at their son with awe.
We did it.
Lydia whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
He's perfect.
Mark smiled, his eyes misty.
He really is.
They named him Jacob after Mark's father, and from the moment he entered the world, Lydia felt a sense of completeness that she hadn't known was possible. The longing that had consumed her for so many years was gone, replaced by a profound, almost possessive love for her son. But as she basked in the glow of new motherhood, there was one person conspicuously absent from the hospital room, Maya. While Lydia and Mark had been caught up in the excitement of Jacob's arrival, Maya had been left behind, staying with a neighbour for the night. It hadn't seemed like a big deal at the time. After all, the birth of a new baby was a momentous occasion, and it was only natural that Maya wouldn't be the focus. But as the days passed, and they returned home with their newborn, the cracks in their family dynamic began to show. Maya stood in the doorway of the nursery, her small frame dwarfed by the towering crib and the vibrant decorations that adorned the walls. She watched as Lydia rocked Jacob in her arms, her expression a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty.
He's really small?
Maya said softly, her voice barely audible. Lydia barely glanced at her, her attention fixed on Jacob.
Yes, he is. Newborns are always small.
Maya shifted her weight from foot to foot, her hands fidgeting at her sides.
Can I hold him?
For a brief moment, Lydia froze, the request catching her off guard. She looked down at Jacob, so tiny and fragile in her arms, and a surge of protectiveness washed over her. The thought of handing him over to Maya, a 7-year-old who barely knew how to handle a baby, made her uneasy.
Maybe later.
Lydia said, her tone dismissive.
He's too young to be passed around right now.
Maya's face fell, her hopeful expression fading into disappointment. She nodded silently and retreated from the room, her shoulders slumped. Lydia barely noticed, too consumed with the joy of holding her newborn son. Mark, however, had noticed. Later that night, after Jacob had been put to sleep, Mark approached Lydia in their bedroom, concern etched on his face.
Lydia, we need to talk.
He began, his voice gentle but firm. Lydia, already exhausted from the demands of caring for a newborn, sighed.
What is it, Mark? I'm really tired.
It's about Maya.
Mark said, sitting down on the edge of the bed.
She's been feeling left out, and I think we need to make more of an effort to include her.
Lydia frowned, rubbing her temples.
Mark, I just gave birth. I'm doing the best I can. Maya needs to understand that things are different now. We have a baby to take care of.
I know,
Mark replied patiently.
but that doesn't mean we should neglect her. She's still our daughter, Lydia. She's been through a lot, and we promised we would always be there for her.
Lydia's frustration flared.
I'm not neglecting her. I'm just focused on Jacob right now. He's a baby, Mark. He needs more attention.
Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair.
I get that, but Maya needs us too. She's feeling abandoned, and I can see it in her eyes. She asked to hold Jacob today, and you barely acknowledged her.
Lydia bristled at the accusation.
She's 7 years old, Mark. She's not equipped to hold a newborn. I'm just being protective.
Protective or not, she's feeling pushed aside.
Mark said, his voice soft but insistent.
We can't let her feel like she doesn't matter anymore.
Lydia didn't respond, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. She knew, deep down, that Mark was right, but she couldn't help the way she felt. Ever since Jacob had come into her life, something had shifted inside her. The love she felt for him was all-consuming, and there simply wasn't room for anything else, not even for Maya. As the weeks turned into months, the tension in the house only grew. Lydia's bond with Jacob deepened, and her attention became almost entirely focused on him. Every waking moment was consumed by feedings, diaper changes, and the endless cycle of care that came with raising an infant. Maya, meanwhile, began to retreat further into herself. Where once she had been eager to help with the baby, she now seemed to avoid the nursery altogether. The cheerful, inquisitive girl who had once brightened their home became quieter, more withdrawn. She spent most of her time alone in her room, her presence barely felt in the household. Mark did his best to bridge the gap, making time to spend with Maya and reassuring her that she was still loved. But it was clear to him that the situation was wearing on her. He had hoped that as time passed, Lydia would adjust to balancing her love for Jacob with her responsibilities to Maya. But instead, Lydia seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. The breaking point came one evening, nearly 6 months after Jacob's birth. It had been a long day, and Lydia was exhausted. Jacob had been particularly fussy, refusing to sleep and crying for hours on end. By the time the house finally settled into silence, Lydia felt like she was running on fumes. She collapsed onto the couch, grateful for a moment of peace. Maya entered the room, her expression hesitant. She lingered in the doorway for a moment before speaking.
Mom, can we talk?
Lydia's eyes flicked toward her, and a wave of irritation surged through her.
Not now, Maya. I'm really tired.
Maya bit her lip, her voice small.
But you never have time to talk anymore.
Lydia sighed heavily, her patience fraying.
I said not now, Maya. I just spent the entire day taking care of Jacob, and I need a break. Can't you see that?
Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, but she nodded and turned to leave the room without another word. Lydia watched her go, a pang of guilt twisting in her chest. But instead of calling her back, she sank deeper into the couch, convincing herself that Maya would understand eventually. After all, she was just a child. She would get over it. The days following that tense interaction were marked by a palpable coldness between Lydia and Maya. The house felt heavier, weighed down by unspoken words and festering resentment. Mark noticed the change and tried, unsuccessfully, to mediate. But it seemed that every attempt he made to bring them closer only pushed them further apart. One evening, a confrontation that had been brewing for months finally exploded. Lydia had just finished feeding Jacob when she overheard Maya and Mark talking quietly in the living room. She paused in the hallway, her ears straining to catch the words.
I don't think Mom loves me anymore.
Maya said, her voice thick with emotion.
Ever since Jacob was born, she doesn't even look at me.
Lydia's heart stopped. She knew that Maya had been feeling neglected, but to hear the words spoken aloud was like a punch to the gut. A wave of defensiveness rose in her chest, and before she could stop herself, she stormed into the room.
That's not true.
Lydia snapped, her voice sharp and accusing.
How dare you say something like that, Maya?
Maya flinched, her eyes wide with fear.
I didn't mean...
Yes, you did.
Lydia interrupted, her voice growing louder.
You think I don't love you. You think I'm some kind of monster just because I'm taking care of my son. Maybe if you weren't so selfish, you'd understand that being a mother means I have to focus on him right now.
Maya's lip quivered, tears spilling down her cheek.
I'm not selfish.
But Lydia was too angry to listen.
You're always making everything about you. Jacob is a baby. He needs me more than you do. Why can't you just accept that?
Mark stood up, stepping between them.
Lydia, stop. You're not being fair.
But Lydia wasn't finished. The words poured out, fueled by months of pent-up frustration and guilt.
You're trying to come between me and Mark, aren't you? You're jealous of Jacob, and now you're trying to cause problems in this family. I won't let you break up my marriage.
Maya's face crumpled at the accusation, her sobs growing louder. Mark, his face pale with shock, turned to Lydia.
What are you saying? She's a child, Lydia. She's not trying to break up our marriage.
Lydia stood, her breathing ragged, staring at Maya. Her words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The room had fallen deathly silent, save for Maya's soft sobs and the faint rustling of the trees outside. Mark stepped forward, his voice low but trembling with emotion.
Lydia, you need to calm down. She's just a little girl.
He pleaded, glancing at Maya, whose face was streaked with tears. But Lydia's anger had already consumed her, clouding her judgment. She pointed an accusing finger at Maya, her voice shaking.
She's been trying to come between us ever since Jacob was born, always seeking attention, always making everything about herself.
Maya backed away slowly, as if trying to shrink into the wall, her small frame trembling with fear. Her wide eyes flickered between Lydia and Mark, desperate for some sense of safety in the midst of the chaos. Mark turned back to Lydia, his frustration boiling over.
That's enough, Lydia. She's our daughter. She needs love and understanding, not these accusations. Can't you see how scared she is?
But Lydia couldn't stop. The resentment she'd buried over the months had erupted like a volcano, and it felt like everything she'd held back was pouring out.
I never asked for this. I never wanted to adopt in the first place. You were the one who pushed for it.
Her words hit Mark like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face contorting with disbelief.
What are you saying?
Lydia's hands shook as she continued, her voice lowering to a harsh whisper.
Now that we have Jacob, everything's different. I don't need her anymore. We don't need her anymore.
The silence that followed was suffocating. Maya stood frozen, her entire body trembling. The words had been too much for her young mind to process, but deep inside, she understood one thing clearly. Her mother no longer wanted her. The realization shattered her already fragile heart. Without waiting for another word, Maya turned and ran out of the room, her small footsteps echoing through the hallway. Mark stared at Lydia, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper.
How could you say that? How could you say that about her?
Lydia's chest rose and fell as the enormity of her words sank in, but instead of feeling remorse, a strange numbness crept over her.